Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we got another great Kentucky history episode here. I have with me David Kirkpatrick. How you doing?
Doing great. You?
Doing good. And I also have joining us again, Mr. Daniel Burge, who is the associate editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. How you doing?
Doing good. Thanks for having me again. It's nice to be back.
Well, you made a good impression, so we figured we would have you on at least a consolation round, you know. But we got a good episode planned here. We're going to talk about some more. We touched on this in our previous episode. We're going to talk a little more about Zachary Taylor, kind of Kentucky's forgotten president, big time influence in American history, but also Kentucky history, and we want to really connect on that. But before we get into it too much, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you've already done this before, but just give us a brief overview of your field and what you're involved in.
Sure. So I work at the Kentucky Historical Society as the associate editor. So sort of all things register related, soliciting articles, putting together special issues, doing things of that nature. I also coordinate the fellowship program. So what our historical society does is each year they will award fellowships, usually to about, it could be as high as 10 people. We've gone like 10 to 15 in a fellowship cycle before. It brings in scholars from throughout the country who are working on some sort of Kentucky related topic, which has been cool for me because I get to sort of meet all these people who are doing all types of cool stuff. So we've had people from France. We recently had a fellow who came. He came from France, and it was just fascinating because he was just interested in Kentucky history. He was, I might butcher the name, University of Lille in France, and just fascinated by Kentucky. So coordinating the program has been fun because we get all different individuals who come to the Historical Society. So that's sort of, I say that's my daytime job. My nighttime job, I do enjoy writing. So I got my PhD at the University of Alabama. I studied with the Civil War historian, George Rabel, who's done a lot. He just came out with a book on Lincoln and McClellan. I don't really do the Civil War, though. My book is more U.S. foreign policy, so Manifest Destiny, which is sort of how I came across Zachary Taylor. It was just sort of a weird, I was more interested in him as a foreign policy person. I thought his presidency was really significant in what he does during that short time he's in office. So that was sort of my introduction to Taylor. Then I moved to Kentucky from Alabama, and I was like, oh, he's buried here, and this is cool. So a lot of it's been sort of learning fun facts about Zachary Taylor over time. So that's kind of my backdoor way of getting to Zachary Taylor. I had no idea who he was, and then I was like, oh, he's actually kind of interesting when you think about it.
Oh yeah. Now the fella from France, did he check out the Lafayette store and all that stuff? I mean,
It was really interesting. So I sort of was chauffeuring him around and talking to him, and he got a kick out of how we say French things. He really he was trying so hard. He's like, I've got to get this down. So he was practicing Versailles and just trying. But I think it was sort of this is really cool because I'm in the United States and there's so many things, named after French people. There's that connection. But it was cool for me because I I mean, I don't know how he's explaining how he's in northern France and
Mm.
what they're doing. And he's like, I'm just fascinated by Kentucky. And I mean, he's got a whole dissertation
Uh-huh.
working on stuff. So he was doing the Pine Mountain Settlement School
Oh
was the
yeah.
dissertation topic. So he's kind of working on that. So like for me, I'm a 19th century guy. So it's like, oh, I'm learning all types of stuff.
Mm.
Just to think that someone in France is sitting there like, I'm going to study the Pine Mountain Settlement School, to me just
Kentucky, yeah, it's awesome. Oh,
I think the
well,
question we have to ask, though, that everybody wants to know is someone from France, native speaker, how many syllables in Louisville?
I could not it seemed like he had a different pronunciation, but I couldn't really get the difference there because we were just driving. We were in Lexington, and I was going to Frankfurt the one day, so we were passing just different places, and he was, kind of giving me, oh, how do I say this or how do I say that? So that was actually I didn't ask him about that, but he found it interesting just the deep connections you had with Lafayette, but
oh yeah.
with everything was just, I think, fascinating.
Well, and it is very wise of him too to be like, hey, how do you all say it? I want to make sure I say it the right way. Not only am
Well,
I a Frenchman in Kentucky, I want to make sure I try to sound as
so
best as I can.
I grew up in Maryland. So, I went to Alabama. So that was a lot of learning for me. Like I mean, everyone's like, "Oh, you're from up north," but we don't really, we don't really know where. They'd always guess Ohio or something. It was always like, "Oh, it's somewhere like Midwest something." Coming to Kentucky, like I have to learn so many place names that I'm not good at. I was doing a podcast. I was interviewing someone, and I forget it was Missouri, and he was said New Madrid. Totally, I said New Madrid. I had it totally wrong. And he goes, no, we actually, we say New Madrid. And I was like,
Yeah.
no.
Oh yeah. And then there's Monticello, or as we say it in Kentucky, Monticello.
I told my wife that she did not. I don't know if she really thinks like that's Monticello.
Yeah. Well, and then you got, I mean, the Paris and bourbon connection. I mean, that's just even. I mean, I don't know. Kentucky might just be the place for French people to come. Honestly, it's dedicated to all of the history. Oh, well, Zachary Taylor. Where do we begin with Zachary Taylor? Obviously, born 1784 in Orange County, Virginia, to Richard and Sarah Dabney Strother Taylor. I believe I got that right. And right around the, not right around the turn of the century, but pretty close to the turn of the century, but right around the American Revolution, United States is being settled. And that's pretty much where we began. And then he moves to Louisville, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things, at least I always found interesting, is he sort of gets classified as a Virginia president.
Mhm.
Like if
Yeah.
you see a list of people who are from Virginia, Virginians. I mean, I grew up in Maryland, so this was kind of always like, in Maryland we have no presidents. Like we never,
Yeah.
no one from Maryland has ever. But Virginia always likes to rub that in of like we're the land of presidents.
Mhm.
So I've always found it interesting that even Taylor, it's sort of, oh, he's Virginian. But
Mhm.
I don't know if you've read the exact age he moves, but he's young when he comes to Kentucky.
Yeah.
And I believe most of his family is still like they stay in Kentucky.
Mhm.
Apart from like his immediate, he
Yeah.
eventually has I think he has a plantation in Louisiana over time, but
Yeah. Yeah. And he kind of has, like I said, his family. He comes to Louisville, and that it's again, it's one of those things that not a lot of. Um, I mean, I'm sure if you wanted to dig far, super far, and dedicate your life to it, you would be able to find a little bit more. But when I'm looking at research, when I'm looking at the basic stuff, trying to find what I can find, not much is mentioned about him in Kentucky. They moved to Louisville. Yeah, not I don't know exact age, but not long after he's been born. The family then settles in Springfield, and for a little bit, but he again is kind of connected to the big issues as he gets to president from the get-go. He's raised on a plantation, loads of enslaved people, and he kind of has this typical education and so forth. But the big thing when his life kind of gets started, he is a military guy or kid, and he wants to join the military. And as soon as he's old enough, which I'll pause there. I say as soon as he's old enough, but like at this time, enlisting in the military, you could be quite young, couldn't you? I mean, what would have been the age in turn of the century, 1812-ish, to enroll in the military? 16?
I would. David might know that.
David, you know this one?
Yeah, there were some articles that came out, I think in the Kentucky Gazette, perhaps, or the Palladium, I forget which one, that spoke about getting parental permission to sign up for the war if you were under 18. So I don't exactly know what the age was, but yeah, you had certainly had teenagers serving, and yeah, I was hoping someone would mention the War of 1812. It doesn't come up very often. So I was excited about Zach Taylor. Yeah, a lot of young people.
Yeah. And we will get to the War of 1812 because Zachary Taylor did serve in the War of 1812. And we'll get through the basic stuff, and then we can get into all that. He when he turns 22, he enrolls in the U.S. Army, and that's around 1808. But he then marries Margaret Mackle Smith, and they have 6 children and so forth. And then that's almost where and it is in a sense where his Kentucky connection stops, because then he goes to Mississippi, and that's where he buys Cypress Grove Plantation. And not to say he leaves Kentucky, but he does kind of go, and this is where his career and all that kind of stuff really takes off and takes place. But again, sad to see him go, but that's what the way the road went for Zachary Taylor. And needless to say, then the War of 1812 starts, I should say, and he serves under Samuel Hopkins in the Illinois Territory. But I'll throw it over to David. What do you got about this with the War of 1812? Would we consider him a Kentuckian fighting, right?
Absolutely. The whole Illinois campaign, which is kind of a disaster for Hopkins, doesn't play out super well. But like you said, he is there. I think his big claim to fame is going to be Fort Harrison, though. He's sort of in defense of that during those early years. So, he made his name and stopped sort of the British and native encroachment on settlements in the lower Ohio Valley. So,
and really, going on with, this is the beginning of his military career and all that kind of stuff, and it just kind of increases. I guess, Daniel, if you were to classify or think of a time, when would be his biggest moment? And I don't want to jump too far ahead. I know the Mexican American War is probably what we're going at, but just throw that out there.
What's kind of interesting to me is, like David mentioned, it's not like he really gets that famous from the War of 1812. So it's not like he sort of catapults the fame like you see like an Andrew Jackson or somebody, William Henry Harrison. He doesn't really have that explosion in popularity or even a political push. He's still sort of just working his way up. I think the thing that always strikes me about his military career is it's sort of like everywhere he goes, he's just remarkably competent at his job. Like everyone sort of recognizes that he does a good job during the War of 1812, and he's one of the more competent leaders, but it doesn't really springboard him into, okay, he doesn't have that Battle of New Orleans type moment or, Tippecanoe, predating War of 1812. But the idea that like, these conflicts are sort of making him, and he doesn't become a national hero. But at the same time, if you look at his military career is just fascinating because he ends up in the Black Hawk War. He's down in Florida. He's just sort of everywhere. Like over the early 19th century, he's just there. And everywhere he goes, he's just sort of, moving about. And he sort of gets along with everyone, it seems like. His men always like him. I think everyone sort of recognizes that he's competent at his job. So I think that's one of the interesting things to me. It's not, I don't know. I think he's really a military guy. He's one of those people that's his career, which really is a contrast to a lot of people who, Jackson is, but he's sort of, he's back at his plantation most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Taylor, he's everywhere in the 1810s, 20s, and 30s. I mean, he's just out there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and this is the interesting thing. You bring up Jackson, and of course, I mean, Jackson is a big known person during this time. And even today, people, if you throw out presidents' names,
Mhm.
Jackson is going to be mentioned before Taylor. It's just
Yes.
that's the way it is. But some interesting things just during this time, like as he commanded Fort Howard in the Michigan Territory and those sorts of things. And during this time, he actually dines with James Monroe, and then who would be future President Andrew Jackson. So it really goes with what you kind of said. He kind of just naturally gets popular, I guess, if that makes sense, or like a regular kind of uh, just accomplishments. It's not like a big thing. Nothing big really happens that catapults him. He just slowly gains that momentum, I guess. But
And he's not as politically connected as a lot of other guys you see. Like Andrew Jackson's he's pretty adept at politics.
mhm,
Like
mhm.
he goes to Tennessee and it's just like, he knows the right people and
Yeah,
he knows how to sort of get into those positions where he leads a militia or he's doing this. Like he's really good at that. Taylor's related. I don't know if I was going through the list earlier this morning prepping for this, and like Taylor's related to a lot of famous people. Like he's a third cousin somehow of James Madison. Like there's all these people that are just like in there, but it's not like his family ties are really what gets him
mhm,
promotions or anything like that. Like he's really working his way up sort of just through the ranks.
mhm. Yeah,
He's not sent to West Point or it's not like he kind of goes that route. It's
yeah.
more the old school
Blue
fighting.
collar, I
Yeah.
guess. Um, but again, the he did fight in the Black Hawk War. Yeah, I don't know a lot necessarily about that. What was that really about? I mean, I know it involved Native Americans and so forth, but and it was in the towards Michigan. But what would be the best way to sum that up? I don't have a way, or do you all?
Yeah, go ahead, David.
It doesn't last very long. It starts out sort of as a border dispute, a border skirmish, and several militia units. Correct me if I'm wrong, and this are activated, and it sort of spirals out larger than either side I think expects it to, and it's a short conflict up that way, but well, short in terms of thinking of the Ohio Valley and the constant fighting between indigenous peoples and the
Yeah.
settlers. It doesn't last as long as those things do.
Hmm.
But yeah, Black Hawk's War is sort of a footnote now, but it really helped, I guess, cement the push westward for some of those tribes in the Western Great Lakes region. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think the one I'm more familiar with, just because it popped into my story, they also send Taylor down to Florida, where he
Hmm.
does he's involved. I think it's the Second Seminole War.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
but it's basically like David was saying, it's more of they're trying the removal process with different groups, and so when individuals push back, and I believe that's sort of like the story of Black Hawk. I think he's trying to push back against some of those policies.
Hmm.
I know in Florida, what Taylor tries to do is essentially stamp out the resistance in Florida, which had been particularly like difficult. The U.S. military had just struggled down in the First Seminole War, and then he was somewhat effective down there. So I think they're more. I think the best parallel is like late 19th century when the U.S. does start sort of placing Native Americans on reservations.
Hmm.
And you see those conflicts way out west in like the Dakotas, or you start to see those types of things happen.
Hmm.
I think that's kind of what you're starting to see in the 1830s and 40s is individuals being removed, and when they push back, it's kind of like,
You're
okay, got to
saying,
spend in the military to make
yeah.
sure everything goes along.
Hmm. And I think it's they're not well. And sometimes we get caught up in it today as well. Like, but these conflicts got to have this name to them. So they had, it's this big war, and
Mhm.
in reality, it's probably not really as big as it is, but it's called the Seminole War. So you
Yeah.
think, okay, this was a big deal and so forth, but it probably these not to diminish or put down the loss of life and that sort of thing. But it's just not as big of a conflict as, say, fighting over the Ohio Valley, which was basically 30 years, or maybe even more than that, honestly, maybe, 30, 40 years. Go ahead.
Doesn't really become as much of a political issue in the sense that when you get to the war with Mexico, you're going to have like the pro, war people and the anti-war people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is a little bit of opposition to the Seminole Wars, but for the most part, both parties sort of agree that it needs to be done.
Yeah.
And so whether you're a Whig or like as the parties start to form, I mean, Jackson takes a harder line than a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
The Whigs are they go along with it pretty much. So there's not really like that opposition, like to your point that it's sort of a smaller conflict. There's not really like a massive anti-war protest or people going like, don't fight. Those things are pretty limited. Even Abraham Lincoln just always jokes about the Black Hawk War as just being like minor.
Mm-hmm.
Like
he was enlisted, right?
Yeah, he was.
That was his own military service.
Yeah, and he just sort of makes fun of it all the time.
Well, and speaking of like the Seminole War, the Second Seminole War, that's where Taylor gets his nickname Rough and Rowdy. And one of the bad things, or one of the I guess marks or tarnishes on his legacy is he was criticized for like sicking bloodhounds on the Seminoles and that sort of stuff.
Which is just as a side note, I don't know if you look at cartoons, I love cartoons, so I always use them like in everything I do. If you look at a lot of cartoons of Zachary Taylor, especially from the 1840s, like when he runs for president, oftentimes they'll have Zachary Taylor, and he'll kind of look like he does in his pictures, kind of poorly dressed, just kind of hunched over, just kind of like a run-of-the-mill guy. There's oftentimes two dogs next to him. So that becomes a big criticism of him, that he used the bloodhounds, basically to track individuals in Florida. Oftentimes it's a criticism as well, because at that time people see him as mainly being in Louisiana and Mississippi, and they're also using bloodhounds to track down enslaved people. So especially in the North, that becomes sort of a big people try to use it against him. It doesn't really stick that well, but if you do see cartoons, I'm always just amused because they'll throw those little details in there. But if you ever see him, if it's a critical cartoon, they'll often have like two little bloodhounds next to him.
Oh,
that's a reference back to the Seminole Wars, where allegedly he used bloodhounds to sort of track down people.
Tricky newspapers. Throwing in those digs.
Those cartoons though are very specific. Like you've got to kind of like get the joke before you get the joke. But yeah.
And looking back at that today, if you didn't know that, it would not make any sense. You'd say, "Oh, he's a dog lover. He likes dogs."
Like he likes dogs. Like he's got horses. He's got dogs. He's just.
Oh well. So moving forward to the Mexican American War, and again, this is the big. Well, actually, I think I might have skipped over something. Jefferson Davis asked to court Taylor's daughter, which is a big Kentucky connection as well, and he said no. So, I don't know. Maybe did his daughter end up marrying somebody in the military, or
no? She ends up marrying Jefferson Davis.
Oh, what really?
Oh yeah. So that's a weird sort of odd fact. Is Zachary Taylor, technically speaking, is Jefferson Davis's father-in-law? Which, imagine that.
Wow.
But Taylor's daughter, and I'm blanking on her name, the one who marries Jefferson Davis, she dies incredibly fast. Like their marriage is really short. Davis will marry again.
Okay.
Jefferson Davis like remarries, but it's always like it's kind of a running joke because Taylor doesn't approve of Jefferson Davis. It's mainly a military thing. He's a military man. He moves around a lot. He doesn't think his daughter should marry someone who might be moving around a lot. Davis was not quite as wealthy at that time, so that
might have been another part of it.
But it's also hilarious because during 1848, when I'm jumping ahead, but when Taylor runs for president, He's a Whig. So Jefferson Davis is a diehard Democrat. I mean, he is, hardcore Democrat. So Davis, even in a lot of speeches, he doesn't really attack Zachary Taylor that much in his speeches. He goes a lot at Millard Fillmore and will say, like, we don't want Fillmore. But it's just an interesting dynamic that's like his former, I don't know if you say like your ex-father-in-law, but like is running for president on the opposite party that you don't like. That's just, I don't know. It's just one of those weird connections.
Man, yeah, the Kentucky connections, man. They're awesome. So jumping back to where we were, the Mexican-American War, which is a big national conflict. You got people on both sides and so forth. Where does Taylor fall in all this?
This is the trickiest thing because this is what I dealt with in the book. No one really knows from a political perspective. Zachary Taylor very famously comes out later and says, like, I've never voted before in a presidential election. So like that's often a joke that people make, like, oh, Taylor said. Now his claim was he was moving around in the military so much. He was never really stationed. He would claim in one spot, so that he wasn't voting because of that. He was never really involved in politics. And he always saw that as sort of a net positive, in that he sort of saw himself as like a George Washington type figure, for lack of a better, like he's someone who's sort of outside of politics. He's not, a lifelong politician or anything like that. He's sort of outside. But I mean, he eventually runs on the Whig ticket. The Whigs do nothing but criticize the war. So it is a really interesting dynamic that a lot of people have tried to figure out, like, how do your party consistently for 2 years says the war is bad and evil, but then you run the guy who's almost mainly responsible for getting a lot of victory. So he comes out in 1848 when they eventually decide to run him. And he says basically, like, he gives his sort of, I'm a Whig. I believe in essentially the ideas of Henry Clay. He kind of comes out with his platform. His argument is that you can defeat Mexico without taking land from them, because he thinks that that's sort of the best option, is that you win militarily, you defeat Mexico, but you don't need to actually take their land. In that sense, I actually think Taylor's pretty astute, because I think he understands that people are going to fight over the land if you take it from Mexico. So I do think he's actually a lot, I don't know. I mean, he's right, because the U.S. does fight over the land. Like, is slavery going to go into those territories? Is it not? Like, that becomes
a big issue.
Yeah, it's a big issue. But the other thing I will say is Taylor wins a string of victories. Polk is really sort of erratic as a president. He doesn't like all the attention that Taylor gets. He becomes very fearful that Taylor's going to be popular. So he sort of foresees that, they just saw with Andrew Jackson that you can win military victories and like use that to get political power. So Polk strips Taylor essentially of command, turns it over to Winfield Scott. It's like, hey, you go lead our troops. Which, the joke's on them, Winfield Scott was a Whig too. So he also runs. He's not as popular as Taylor, I guess, but he's also a Whig. So Polk sort of ends up, I don't know, catapulting Taylor to the presidency. He has to ride in that awkward carriage ride of like, hey, this is my war, but you get to be president.
You won the war for me, but hopping beside me here.
And they hate each other. Like, Polk really, he thinks Taylor's an incompetent moron. Like, he thinks it's kind of that hatred. He sees him as just a professional soldier who doesn't really have political experience. So Polk just he just sees him as being a non-entity. Like, oh, he's popular because he won a battle.
Yeah. Well, which is kind of the way it went back then. That's how you got popular.
Can you draw comparisons between Taylor and Eisenhower in some ways? Because Eisenhower is sort of this outside of politics guy. He becomes a general, and his fame is from that. But he's very even-keeled. And so even going into like the post-World War II, the Cold War kind of stuff, Eisenhower frustrates a lot of his own party because he rails against the industrial complex, and he He doesn't want to fight the Soviet Union. He wants peacetime, that sort of thing. Is there a comparison there?
See, I think that's probably the best comparison you can have, because I think the assumption sometimes, especially historians make, is that, oh, Taylor's a military man, so he must be in favor of like military action and war and this type of thing. But I think your point with Eisenhower is really good. I think sometimes, even though we don't elect generals really anymore to high office or vote them in as president, those aren't typically the guys who want to get involved in a lot of wars. I mean, Eisenhower, if you look at like you said with the Cold War presidents, like he's kind of the most even keeled of like, here's what we need to do. We don't have to overstate this. No, the Soviet Union is not going to blow us off like he just has a more realistic understanding, I think. I think that's what Taylor's trying to do. He's trying to say mid-19th century, like, I've seen war. It's terrible. We don't want to really get involved in another war. And I think a lot of people respond to that. So I think that's a really good comparison between the two. I think the one problem, and I know we'll get into this, is Zachary Taylor dies so quickly. I mean, if Eisenhower comes in the office and he dies after a year, can you really assess what he does? I mean, it's incredibly difficult to assess that. But I think that's a really good comparison, because I think they're both outsiders, they're both military guys. Taylor says this a lot. He really looks up to George Washington. That's sort of his guy. Like, outside of Jefferson, outside of all the other political, like Jackson, he kind of pushes those guys aside, and he always sees Washington as being that guy who, served in the military, was a military man, wasn't super well educated. Like, he didn't have all the polish that you see with Jefferson, but just a really good leader. And I think that's who Taylor always looked up to the most, was Washington, as sort of his, if he wanted to be president, like, that's the guy he sort of wanted to imitate. Where most other people, I mean, the Clays, even later Lincoln will be more of a follower of Clay. I don't know. Clay looks to Jefferson. Like, they all kind of look to different people, but I think Taylor was always a Washington guy. Like, military connection makes sense. Like, they both saw themselves as military men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but I think that's a really good analogy with Eisenhower,
mm-hmm.
who also kind of gets overlooked, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. We're going to pause right there with our discussion about Zachary Taylor. Want to again thank Daniel and David for coming on and talking about this important Kentucky president. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.